Hi, my name is Chris, and this video is a conversation between me and Jason from Points in Focus about the Canon R system and also the RF lenses, the different use cases that we get out of them, and of course also the whole evolution of what Canon has built around that new ecosystem of mirrorless cameras. We're covering all kinds of topics from what we shoot and what our goal is for these lenses, what might be a good idea to focus on, whether it is actually the image quality and megapixels, or if it is the usability of a specific lens, having it with you, not having it with you. And of course also some of the nitpicky details that we don't really like about the Canon R system or the RF lens lineup. Now, I'm publishing these types of conversations here on this channel because I think that they are relevant here. However, I also have ideas about moving these things off to another channel, and that also is kind of in the works, and also building a podcast around that. So if you're watching this video or wanting to listen to these kind of things as podcasts, please let me know in the comments down below, because then I can maybe make that work and move those long-form conversations off to a different channel, as I have done with my German podcast that is called the Macher Café, which you will also find linked in the description below. For this video here, of course, you will find chapter markers in the usual places for YouTube chapters, and without further ado, I think it's best for Jason to just give us a bit of an overview of what he's doing with his camera gear, and of course, with that, what kind of drives his decision-making around getting new lenses into his kit. And so with that, hi Jason, and maybe can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell me, what do you do, what is your goal with photography or videography, and also like the realm of lenses you're interested in most and the use case you have around that.
So I've been doing this photography thing for over a decade now. Not all professionally, a lot of it's been sort of as a hobby. And my focus is largely at this point on wildlife, landscapes, and travel kind of stuff. Like I've gotten to where I can get out and go places, and it's way more fun for me going places than it is to take pictures of stuff locally. So that's kind of like I said, my focus. The whole video side of things is, I think, really just to sort of support and roll along with that kind of photography side of things, is go places, find something interesting, share it, cover that kind of thing. So, I mean, yeah, that's kind of, like I said, that's kind of where I'm going with the whole photography thing. But I guess in the context of this whole discussion, that's the relevant thing is, like travel, landscape, and wildlife, is that influences my thought process in what I'm looking for in a lens.
Right.
Probably far more than a lot of things other people would think were primary factors.
Yeah. And with that, we have talked about before, you said like a lot of wildlife includes a lot of telephoto work because you obviously can't get as close to whatever you're shooting. And then contrasting that to, for example, me, my primary focus at the moment would be, I want to be able to shoot videos and I want to produce content for social media, as well as being able to do or slide more into the area of, for example, doing some type of travel portrait work and be able to shoot in that realm. Now, how do you like the RF lineup so far? Do you think or do you also consider Canon having had a great run with the last couple of years, because the Canon EOS R is not that old at this point, and they basically revamped the lineup? Are you happy with what they have got at this point?
Yes and no. There's places that they've made specific design decisions that I'm not a fan of, and there's places where they've made design decisions where I understand the design decision, but I can also understand why a lot of people are not fans of it as well. For example, the 100 to 500. I like having a teleconverter, just as a, on the 100 to 400, I almost always had it on the lens, the EF lens. So on the 100 to 500, I like the idea of having a teleconverter if I need that extra reach when I'm shooting. Like, I don't want to be within hugging distance of a grizzly bear. So just, sorry, not a little too close. But on the the 100 RF 100 to 500, the teleconverter won't physically mount with the lens fully retracted. It has to be extended to 300 millimeters and further. And that kind of frustrates me in a sense where, so first of all, if it starts raining and I want to put the gear away, I'm trying to put it in a backpack. And if I'm trying to put it in a backpack, I have to have room in the backpack to have that extended 300 millimeter lens. I can't crush it down and it's just an inch longer because of the teleconverter. The other problem that I kind of run into is, when you watch, you go look at lens reviews or whatever, everybody who does lens reviews, it's like, the digital picture is a perfect example. They do a lens review and they show you like the image quality at 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, whatever. And then they show you the image quality at 500 plus a 1.4 teleconverter and 500 plus a 2x teleconverter. Like the idea is that you're going to take the teleconverter off and then you're going to zoom wider. In my experience, that doesn't always work in practice in the field. In a lot of cases, you're zooming wider because the animal's coming towards you. Maybe you're in a vehicle, so you don't have to like get out of the way. And when you can't zoom all the way out, so like on the 100 to 400 with the teleconverter, I'm stuck at 140. Well, 140 isn't that much more telephoto than 100. With the 100 to 500, if I have a teleconverter on it, I'm stuck at 300 plus the teleconverter, and that's a heck of a lot more telephoto than 100 or 140. So there's some things like that where I'm frustrated with their design decision. There's other things like the 70 to 200, both of them, the f4 and the f2.8, where they went from a non-extending lens to an extending lens you get a much more compact package when you're putting it in your bag, essentially.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of people complaining about that. And I can understand it feels like the old lens didn't extend, the new lens does, and that can feel maybe like a bit of a step backwards, maybe. But on the same token, I can understand where the thinking would be at Canon to we're going to make it a more compact lens. And, this is a perfect example. I bought a 70 to 200 f4 70 to 200 f4 because the 70 to 200 f2.8 was too big to fit in the bag that I was carrying with, I was carrying that and my 100 to 400, and I couldn't put the 2.8 in the bag with the other lens. And I didn't really need the faster aperture. So the more compact lens meant that I had the lens and I could use it when I needed it, so there's definitely things that bug me a little bit personally. There's some things that I see why it bugs other people. But I always kind of keep looking back at sort of the broader picture of, what compromises are being made, because there's always a compromise. And so if you don't have that, if you have that non-extending zoom, the lens has to be bigger. If you don't limit, like the teleconverter thing, the lens has to be bigger, that whole kind of thing. So it's where you start making those trade-offs in this feature versus that feature and how they play out and how things maybe don't play out quite the way maybe you think they will. I mean, again, 100 to 400, when I started thinking about it, well, it's a 500, not a 400. Do I really need the teleconverter? I mean, it's only 40 millimeters shorter on the long end or 60 millimeters shorter on the long end than my 100 to 400 with a teleconverter without the teleconverter. So it's like the lens has a teleconverter in it for free without having the stop loss aperture, the whole thing, and having to take it off. So I don't have one yet. I can't buy them. They're not in stock anywhere. It's like I want one, but I'm actually kind of interested with that to see if the whole do I really even need a teleconverter anymore? If that doesn't become a factor.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is that all the nitpicky things are features and not the image quality, because that's something that, at least from my point of view, from what I've seen also in reviews, it's all the lenses have gotten better, sharper, in many ways, specifically with the prime lenses, they've gotten faster with the aperture. So all of those things have been improved. Some of the lenses are ridiculously heavy and big compared to what was available beforehand. But at the same time, I think from all things considered, they are in a very interesting progression with this new RF mount, with this new lineup, and with the quality of glass they are providing us with. And it's going to be interesting, obviously, what other manufacturers are also going to be bringing to the table, because at the moment there's just a handful of lenses from other manufacturers. But the next thing, what I was kind of like considering, or for me, is I do a lot of videography. Vlogging is one of the things that I am working toward. So that's something where I'm on the complete opposite of the spectrum from what you're speaking about. Because for me,
so
it's about...
you're on the wide end, the kind of where I'd
Exactly.
end up being if I was shooting landscapes almost.
Exactly. Like for me, the vlogging type stuff, the previous dream lens that I would have wished for in the non-RF system, but the EF system, would have been the 16-35. And then obviously, until a couple of weeks ago, the obvious choice would have been the 15-35. And now we have the 14-35 f4 in the ring as well. Now, that's half of my part, or half of my story, because historically, when I was thinking about lenses, I started out with something like the 24 millimeter, 50 millimeter, and 85 millimeter. And I had primes in that realm with like the 1.8 versions of whatever was at the time. And I also got a 14 millimeter completely manual lens at the time from some obscure company, non-Canon, and it was complete manual, and it was great to shoot HDR landscape work with that at the time. But then I kind of like noticed I really don't shoot the 50. If I shoot the tele, then it's like 85 and 20 something ish for video work and like vlogging and stuff like that. And so I ended up with the Sony system, 25 millimeter, 85 system. Like I traveled the world with it. I really enjoyed it. I know that I use the wide end more because it's more of my use case in terms of like being able to do the landscapes at the same time as I'm doing a video. But now with this trip coming up, I have to think about whether or not it makes sense for me to kind of like invest in that area. And that's what I'm doing, or considering to do before October. And at the moment, what I'm looking at is the 15-35 2.8, because I really like that area and I do a lot in it. And so I am willing to take the weight from the 2.8 compared to the 14-35 with the 4.0. And I've seen you talk about that aspect in one of your last live streams where you talked about exactly those two lenses in a way. And the other thing is the 70-200, where you talked about with the now extending tubes. And I have to say, I love the previous versions with the 70-200 non-extending, because it has an iconic look. It's a very much used, a very popular lens, and it has the whole like no dust comes in and like all of those aspects. But now looking at it from the place of I know how it feels to carry all of that stuff. The reduced weight is amazing, and the size is obviously also a factor, because now with that I can pack I could pack the lens once I have it on the face, basically not having it sideways, and there's like almost room for like a drone or something. And you can basically take two lenses now. So I personally appreciate the way they have now gone with those lenses to the area of being retractable and not being completely fixed.
That's one of the things you got to think about. Like, what is the lens? What state does the lens exist in 90% of the time? 90%
Yep.
of the time, it is not in front of my face taking a picture. 90% of the time, it is in a bag and I'm going somewhere. Or I'm, I mean, if it's a studio environment, it's not that, who cares? Either size doesn't matter, but if you're traveling, and like I said, I think that's a big focus for me photography wise now, because it's far more interesting to go somewhere else and see something that's not just your local situation. The lens that you have is always better than the lens you left at home.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're making compromises in terms of, you know, yeah, it's not as iconic. Yeah, it could be less good. I mean, it's true. Like, if I had the money to throw, I'd have a fancy cinema camera sitting on on a tripod behind me just as a background element. In fact, if Canon puts out a paper model of one, I might even consider that. Just because it looks cool. I mean, like
Yeah.
there isn't, when you get down to it, there is an aspect of photography that this is art, and being inspired by your tools to go do something, to make pictures, to make better pictures, to go out and feel like. I remember I had a 1D Mark III and I had just gotten the 24-70 f2.8, and this was the old reverse zoom one that weighed like half a ton, or whatever it was. It was like ridiculously heavy. Um, and I put that on and I went walking out somewhere and I felt like a badass professional photographer. Like I was,
Hmm.
this is what photography is. I then carried that lens on my shoulder, that same lens and camera combination on my shoulder, hiking 4 or 5 miles in Zion National Park, and went, this is not fun. Like my
Hmm.
shoulders hurt. I'm constantly changing the load. Like, I'm not taking pictures most of the time, because a lot of the times you're on a trail, you're hiking, you're going to where there's an interesting picture. You find an interesting picture, you stop 30 seconds, click, 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 click. Maybe a minute. You really deliberate or something. Like you're talking a few minutes, and then you're back hiking for another 20, 30 minutes or whatever. And it's like, you know, that badass, iconic, professional looking setup. Well, I mean, yeah, I go to the lighter lens just because the lens you actually want to take with you and actually want to go hike this trail or climb this mountain or do this thing. Uh, that you're always going to get better pictures from the pictures you took than the pictures you wish you took because you just didn't, you left the stuff at home because it was too heavy. So
Yeah.
weight is, and that's why I said, like, when we started, I said a lot of my criteria for evaluating a lens isn't what most people would think. Most people, it's going to be resolution, it's going to be distortion, it's going to be chromatic aberrations, and it's going to be aperture. How fast is the lens so I can blur out and have those super smooth, bokeh-licious backgrounds? And that's
Yeah.
their criteria. And I went down that road, and now it's starting, like, and for many years, it's basically, since carrying 40 pounds of camera gear on my back hiking, uh, you know, uh, it's started to be things like weight. Weight's super important.
Hmm.
The lighter you can be in, and this is in general. Like, I mean, okay, if I'm going, literally get in my car, go to the airport, get on a plane, get off the plane, go to a studio, shoot a portrait session, get back on the plane. Like, I don't really care that much if I'm carrying a 4 pound 28-70 f2 or three
Yeah.
pounds or what. I mean, it's ridiculously heavy. I almost bought one, and the Canon didn't have them, and I'm so glad they didn't have them, because I realized after I sat down and thought about it and went, I'm never going to take this anywhere because it's too bloody heavy. Like, I don't want to hike somewhere with this. And what am I going to do with the f2 aperture? I'm shooting a landscape. Like,
Yep.
you're not going to shoot that at f2. Uh, so it started to be things like weight.
Hmm.
How small is the lens? Like, okay, there's limitations. If you're shooting a full frame camera, you're never going to have lenses as small as shooting a 4/3 camera. It's just, you got to have a certain focal length to cover the sensor for a certain angle of view, and that implies a certain size lens. And there's things that manufacturers can obviously do to collapse them, compress them. The 600 f11 and the 800 f11, that you collapse it when you store it and extend it to shoot with it. Is a perfect example of that. Like, the lens has to be a certain size to have a 600 millimeter focal length. It doesn't matter that it's diffractive optics or that you've got all kinds of crazy optical stuff going on in there. It's still got to be a certain size. Like, you just can't make it that much smaller. So collapsing it is a reasonable solution for that whole. So it's small, it goes in your bag, and you can take it somewhere.
The versatility goes up exponentially with those kind of situations when you have more available at a lighter place, at a smaller size, and obviously, as you mentioned, like if you are a Olympics sports photographer, you don't care about how much the weight is because you have a monopod right in front of you, and you're just sitting on the sidelines of some field, right?
And if you're from a major press agency, you've got somebody helping you with the gear. You know, like they're
Yep.
not. It's not like one photographer goes and they have to like. Some cases that's true that one photographer goes and carries all their own gear, but in a lot of other cases, and this is why the Nikon 200 to 400 was such a big success.
Mhm.
Is all of a sudden you had this one lens, and why the Canon 200 to 400 with the teleconverter was an even bigger success is all of a sudden you had this one lens that if you were a sports photographer, it covered your 200, it covered your 400, it covered your 500 and change. All you had to do is flip a switch. It was a zoom, so like I said, you could track as they were, players, athletes, whatever, were running towards you, uh, and it cut down weight. And it cut down the amount of
Mhm.
gear you had to take because now you weren't taking a 500 and a 400 2.8 and a 200, a 70 to 200 and a 300, and all this other stuff. It was like you had one lens that covered, and in some ways, that's the big selling point in some respects of like the 14 to 35. It's in some ways the big selling point of what Canon's doing with the RF lenses as a whole. So the 100 to 400 became a 100 to 500. The 16 to 35 became a 15 to 35, and a lot of people forget, I think, that when you start talking about wide angle lenses, millimeters are huge. That's a big jump from 15 to 16. And then from 14 to 16, like, the original f4L zoom was a 17 to 40. And then they did the 16 to 35 f4 with image stabilization. And now with the RF platform, they're giving you a 14 to 35 f4 that's image stabilized, and like that's compared to the capabilities that you would have had in L Glass a couple of years ago, like, or 10 years ago especially, like that's a huge deal. And you're almost to, with that 14, you're not quite, but you're almost getting to that uh 12 to 24 range. Like you're not quite there, but you're getting there, and you're getting that extra, that the 24 to 35, which then is helpful because 35's not
It's like
so
a
wide
natural
angle.
look.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a really natural looking image. So like you can do portraits with the 35, and the people don't look horribly distorted. And then
Yep.
you can go shoot like architecture or crazy landscapes at 14. I mean, okay, you can shoot portraiture at 14. Art Wolf
Mhm.
has tons of stuff that he's shot of like kids in Africa and stuff like that, where he's shooting at 16 and he's like, big feet, and all the kids' faces are, they're far enough away that their faces aren't distorted, but it like distorts their body and their feet. And the pictures look cool. I mean, they're not
Yeah.
traditional portraiture,
It's an
but
art form to do that at that
yeah,
point because it's a very different feel. But the magic of that range and getting that exposure of like getting the 14 all the way to 35 or even 15 to 35 is exactly why I want to have that available, and I don't want to have just something between 15 and 24 because I like the 35. It's what I'm using right now, right? I have a 35 1.8, the macro lens, right on this lens that I'm talking into. And the other lens that I own is the 24 to 105 f4, which is essentially the kit lens for the Canon EOS R when it came out. And
and
I
it's still a
like
rock solid lens. Like
it's
this
incredible.
is,
Like it's an L lens. Like it's not just an
yeah,
1855, right? Like
yeah.
it's
This
an
is
absolutely phenomenal lens.
Canon's lens lineup, like they do kit lenses, because I got a 24 to 105 when I, as a kit lens, when I got a 5D Mark III. So this is the first
Hmm.
generation EF version. Uh, and it's like, it's not a joke lens. Like it's not the
Yep.
18 to 55 that you got with a 60D or 70D or something like that. We were talking about complaints. There's actually the one complaint that I do have with the RF lens system is the cheap lenses. The 24 to 105, the one that goes to 7.1, the variable zoom, the non-L,
Hmm.
and the 24 to 240. Now 24 to 240 is not a crap lens to go down the line of thinking of. I'm not speaking of specific lenses, but that's if you're a travel photographer, that's a super versatile lens for, like, okay, you're paying, there's tons of compromises, right? The image
Yeah.
quality isn't going to be as good as a 2x or 3x zoom. The aperture is going to be slower. It's not, there's a whole slew of things that but in terms of the, like, take a lens and go somewhere, be able to shoot everything from landscapes to portraits to, well, I shoot landscapes with a 100 millimeter lens in times, so because the compression
Hmm.
just makes them look cool. But to, even some kinds of wildlife you can do at 240. Like, it's not, a world ending thing to not have a 600. I don't have a 600, so, like, it's not world ending not to have one. uh,
Yeah.
what I don't like that Canon's done with those lenses is the and it's not the requirement to use software distortion correction that on the lens that bothers me as much as, because it feels weird to say, like, I'm bothered by software distortion correction and it's not the right thing, but I do that to every picture I take. Like, every picture I take, I bring into Lightroom and I do distortion correction on the
Yeah.
lens.
Basically automatically.
Yeah, because why not? Why not have those image artifacts not in the image? What I don't like is that they're not doing it in camera in RAW, which I
Hmm.
know is antithetical to the idea of a raw image is just straight up what the sensor has, and we're not going to process it. But it also means that if I shoot with that lens and my software that I'm using down the road doesn't do the distortion correction, I can't undo it. Now, like, it's only really an issue at 24 on those lenses where they're um, much wider than 24 millimeters, and they vignette mechanically with the lens. So it's, but still, to me, I don't want to say, like, from the pure photography stand or photographer's standpoint or the purist standpoint, but for me, it's, if they did it in camera and I could get the right image out of, in the original file without having to shoot JPEG, because I don't want to do that. Like, in the raw, that I don't have to worry about, I'm going through my images like 20 years from now, and I've got Lightroom 97 or whatever, or Adobe's gone out of business and somebody's come along and replaced it, and they don't do the distortion correction anymore because we've forgot about it in the 20 years that we've been, not using these lenses anymore. Uh, how do you fix that? You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Like, I'd like to not have to worry about where it's going to be at some point down the road. So that's why I'm not a big fan of those. Even though I
Okay.
probably would seriously consider, like, a 24 to 240 is just a, like, uh, light, do it all kind of, when you're traveling, especially if you're scouting or you're carrying a big lens that's heavy, that's a light solution. And again, weight, the lighter you are, if you have to carry the gear, the happier you're going to be. And the happier you are, the better the pictures you're going to make. Because you're not going to be like, no, I don't want to take this picture. I want to go sit down. You're going to be like, let's go make a picture.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually have not had that lens or those lenses on the radar. For me, like
Well, I didn't
we
either.
we
But we were
we
talking about
talked
the lineup as a whole. So,
yeah, but like not it's interesting to speak about because like we also spoke about outside of this video about how faster lenses or like the faster the lens, the more the focus is on the aperture, right? Like, and for me, I
yeah.
noticed that I am kind of drawn to that aspect, right? Like my holy grail at the moment would be 1535 2.8 and 7200 also 2.8. The thing is, if I consider the weight and also the probability or like the fact that this here shoots at a 4.0 like a 4.0 at 105 millimeters already, like I can get used to how this feels at certain focal lengths. It's not going to compare to 200 millimeters, but at least it gives me something to kind of like work with, and it is a 4.0. Now I am kind of fixed at the thing that I am not going to invest into glass that's variable aperture. And that's kind of like, that's my current thing, right? Like, I don't know how smart that is, because maybe at 240 millimeters, a 6.3 is totally doable, because like a 6.3 might be bad at 70 millimeters or like at 50 millimeters. When you consider like the 1855, like the cheap one with the crop factor cameras, it's like those go up to 5.6, and then you're like with an aperture of 5.6 at about 85 millimeters with a crop factor or something like that. It's like, I never really liked that. But now we are at a point where it's like 6.3 at 200 millimeters. Like, that's a decent shadow fall off or a depth of field that you can kind of work with. So it's actually an interesting lens to look at now in this consideration of like wanting to have less gear or less weight to carry around. It potentially, if someone looks at it from the perspective of, I want to be able to vlog, I want to be able to take any kind of photo that comes my way, this lens with like 24 to 240, 24 is rough to vlog with. Like, I have my experience with this lens here when I do my vlogging, because you really have to get your arm out there to be able to actually keep yourself in frame, and also potentially have a second person in frame. Having some type of a tripod situation to extend your arm helps, but it is getting heavy, because you are like, with the more extension you need,
you've got a big lever out there, and
that kind of can be a really interesting lens, considering it's probably lighter, the 24-240. It's a 4.0 at the start, which is fine. It's not ideal or not perfect or whatever, but it's a great place to get started with and have an all-rounder on your camera that you don't have to take off. You don't risk the image to be exposed to the elements, to any dust or water or whatever you want to have. And like, you just have this go back, so to speak, or like this one go lens. Now, it doesn't make me want to necessarily change my mind about what I would like to go out with, because right now, as I mentioned, 1535 2.8 and 7200 4.0 would be kind of like my holy grail. Like, that's what I always dreamt about the last 5 years or whatever, because I want to have the ability to have the range to kind of like take the compressed portraits out in nature, also do that in type of like I have like a work situation with my partner where we work on a clothing brand and we work with social media content and stuff like that. So like, there's reasons for me to kind of like look into these things, and not just I want to travel and I want to take a couple nice landscape shots I want to put on my Flickr profile or 500px or Instagram. So those things are more and more a consideration for me to also come into the picture to say, okay, what is a smart investment here? What can bring more to the table? How can I work with these cameras and lenses? And in that regard, I think that the lineup is getting really interesting. The way that they are putting diversification in there, now also coming in with cheaper lenses, because I actually thought that like, when you started talking about the cheaper lineup of the RF class, I was like, the non-existent one, right? Like, it's like almost they for a long time didn't have those cheaper lenses. It felt like, because they started with those,
they rolled
1,000.
They rolled. It was like 90% of is L glass. And then it was like, and I was critical of Canon when the R platform came out, because it was like, the R, as far as I'm concerned, really is the sort of mirrorless successor to the 6D Mark II.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going from DSLR to mirrorless, that was at the time, that was the jump. Now, obviously, the R6 is the successor, in my opinion, to the R, but the R was never the successor to the 5D, even though it shared the sensor. And the RP always felt to me like they could have just called it a Digital Rebel, the Digital Rebel R, or something like, because that's what it felt like to me. And, I made an argument at the time, and I'm not going to go too into it now, but that if they can do a $1,200 full frame camera, which is what the RP was, don't bother with crop. Leave the crop to the EOS M, so that it's a super compact, super small platform for the people like my mom, for example. She loves her M5 because it's super compact and tiny, and she doesn't feel like she's carrying around a camera, and she's not happy with a smartphone as a camera, and she's not a professional photographer really at all. And she's always shot like with film. She shot with an SLR, And so she's really comfortable with that. And she gets pictures she's really happy with. And that's like kind of ultimately what really matters, is that you get pictures you're happy with, but leave that for the crop camera. And then if you can hit $1,000, $1,200 for the full frame camera, just keep the R platform full frame. You don't introduce the confusion of, well, some lenses are crop and some lenses are full frame and da 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 da. You can't make the cameras that much smaller because the lens mount's the limiting factor. Like the lens mount requires the lenses and cameras be a certain size, so, and yeah, rock some entry level glass. Like now, I don't think Canon would have been able to get the traction because, as much as I say the R5 really, or the R wasn't really the successor to the 5D class-wise, category, however you want to put it. Like, it felt to me always like it was a tier lower. It's still a good camera. It's still the same image quality as the 5D Mark IV. The 5D Mark IV is a really solid camera. I mean, I was floored when I started reading people saying, well, I never upgraded to the Mark IV because I thought it was just a little bit better. It wasn't that much of an upgrade over the Mark III. And I'm like, I threw my Mark III out the day I got a Mark IV because it went in the drawer and I never used it again because the image quality was so much better, So it's not like it's a crap camera, but it's really hard to say, well, you're going to take your, what is it, like $2,000, 2,000 euros, something like that. I mean, I almost bought one for like 1,600 as a factory refurb, and then put a $4,000 lens or a $3,000 lens on it, because that's the only, I thought the 28-70 was not the right launch lens for the platform. Kind of like I felt like Nikon's the 58 f.95 was really not the right lens to launch the platform, with the platform. In my mind, it was, you want a 16 to, you want a teen to 35, you want a 24 to 70, and you want 70 to 200. And those should be the first three lenses that you put out if you're looking at professional photographers, because those are, if you go look at like sales data where you can find it like based on serial numbers.
Holy Trinity.
Those three lenses sell millions of units a piece. Nikon will be lucky to sell 100,000 units of the 58 f.95. And I'm not I expect Canon will sell more with the 28 to 70 f2 just because it's a more general purpose lens, but it's still a real specialist lens it still fits that general purpose bill, and it's heavy. It's huge and it's heavy. And, so you start kind of getting into this, I don't even know how to put the words together at the moment. It's, the platform needed to have more, at the start, more entry level. It's got some of that now. You could definitely do that with the 24 to 105, the non-L1, or the 24 to 120 non-L1. The Mac 35 millimeter macro is not an L lens. There's the 85 that's not an L lens. There's now the 50 that's not an L lens. So that's getting going. And as much as I want to criticize, even I know Canon went with the lenses that they thought were going to be the most one to show what the platform could do. This is the 28 to 70 and the Nikon f.95. Both of them are, this is what the platform can do. Because you don't see that from Sony. You don't see that really from, Panasonic just announced a 25 to 50 f1.7. But even there, that's a much, sure, it's a half stop faster than the 28 to 70 f2. But it's also, you're giving up that 50 to 70. It's kind of that they to get that speed, they have to give up some of that range, and some of that range makes it less versatile in general. It may be perfect for some photographers, but it's less versatile in general as a product that, maybe you'd buy, maybe I'd buy, maybe somebody else's buy, even though we have all kind of competing, ends of that spectrum of what we really are interested in or what we really need it for.
I think they have made interesting decisions there. I think they made some unconventional ones and in a way really pushed some boundaries for what they were trying to do, what they presented us with. I think that 28 to 70 is a really interesting lens in certain aspects because the way that I see that lens is it's the perfect wedding photographer, event photographer kind of lens. You don't really need much wider than 28 because like unless you really want to get like distorted crowd shots or something like that, but that's a specialty use case in a way. But from 28 to 70, you're all good in the golden area of like you basically get normal looking shots all the way through. And then to put that at f2.0, that's the way that I see a lot of YouTube videos about that lens is basically I sold all my primes and now I have to worry only about one lens when I go to a wedding shoot or something like that. So I think in that way, it's a really interesting glass and put out maybe too early, as you mentioned, but in a way it was like, I think there were like a handful of primes or 2 primes or something like that they presented at the start. They
Yeah, the
had
50 f1.2 and the 85 were the first 2
exactly.
primes.
Yeah,
and then
with
the
those,
70,
the 1.2, those were 1.2 in terms of the aperture, right? And then
right.
the 28 to 70 was with that range. And did they even have the 24 to
The
105 at
24
the
to
start?
105 f4 was one of the launch lenses.
Yeah.
I had notes on a thing because I talked about this in a video a year or 2 ago, like when the R platform was launching, and it
Yeah.
was like it was all L except for like 2 lenses, and it was like they weren't really interesting lenses, like, and I don't remember what they were, and it was like I thought they could have gone lighter on the L, but like I said, because I think about some of it, like, I talk a lot in my videos, in my live streams, I talk about like the engineering business side of things, because like I'm a photographer, you're a photographer, we both want to make money off of this. There's a business perspective that we have in what we're doing. I don't have I can't shoot if Canon and Nikon and Sony and Panasonic go out of business. If nobody's making cameras, I'm not doing photography, and I like doing photography. So I have a vested interest in looking at sort of the business side of things, because sometimes, when everybody gets all caught up in resolution, like, why did they do this or why did they do that? It's like, yeah, but you got to think about, there was a business thought process here. There was something that they were trying to accomplish. Nikon and Canon with the Noct and the 70 24 28 to 70 f2 were trying to show to everybody what their platform could do that nobody else's did.
Yeah.
So, if either of those lenses were the perfect song for your photography, that puts you on that platform. Like,
yeah.
if like, and as much as I can be critical of, like, and Nikon's sort of like, I mean, we talk Canon, but Nikon sort of is a more, to me, frustrating thing, because they're a smaller company that they have recently had significant losses due to some bad business decisions, or not necessarily great business decisions. They wrote off a whole pile of money. I think it was close to the tune of $500 million US equivalent or something like that, in a business venture that just didn't pan out. If you look at their product, what they've been doing with cameras and lenses for the last even like 8-10 years, you can kind of see a little bit of, maybe they don't have the money in R&D to keep up with Sony and Canon and Panasonic. So then to me, it's like, you got to be smart about it. You got to be like on point with where you're putting the money. So a $6,000 4-pound 58 millimeter manual focus only prime that's probably not going to sell a lot. Like, that lens cost a lot to design. I have no idea what the actual the costs of a lens are to design, but that was not an insignificant use of Nikon's resources. How long is it going to take for that to pay back? And how many Z's did they sell because they had that lens? Versus, say, how many EOS Rs did Canon sell because they had the 28 to 70 f2?
Yep.
So like, when you want to get critical about stuff, like I said, there's always there's None of the camera companies will ever talk about it. You'll never see an interview where they sit down with some manager and the manager says, well, we surveyed our users and our users were looking for this, and this is what we thought would be the best thing to show off the capabilities of the new platform, blah, blah, blah. Like, they've got their PR coded line that they're going to talk about. Probably nobody would even ask them that in the first place, because most people talking about photography is like, well, how come you didn't have more resolution in this? Or why did you choose to do this? Instead of like, I mean, all RF lenses are focused by wire. I don't know how much of a fan I am of that, but then, that could also be good in a lot of senses. Like, you can change which direction the focus ring turns. So if you're a
depending on
right-hand
what
rule
platform you
focus,
come or something.
So that's certainly possibly an advantage. You can turn off the focus ring, which, I mean, it sounds like, well, why would you want to do that? Well, like, if I'm shooting something and I want to lock the focus, like night landscapes, when I was shooting night landscapes before, it was then dig through my bag, find the little roll of gaffer tape, tear off a piece of gaffer tape, and tape the focus ring so that I couldn't bump it while I was doing something with the camera, so the camera didn't lose focus. Well, now it's just the focus ring's dead. It doesn't do anything. Like, it's off, and I can have it set up like that all the time. So I'm never having to worry about that when I'm shooting any subject matter. So, like, there are definitely pros to it, but there's also cons to it.
I think Canon has made a whole lot of really interesting decisions with the RF system. And I think the lineup of lenses has grown to a place where I'm really interested in certain ones of the lenses. And I also think that the whole lineup of cameras they have brought out are really interesting and great, despite certain limitations that I still see with the system that I would like to change within the next year or two, because otherwise they are going to be left behind in certain areas for certain users, specifically toward Sony for the most part at the moment, looking at specifically the 30-minute record time limit. But maybe that's a topic for a follow-up video to kind of like look at what our wish list would be for upcoming Canon cameras, or the RF mount camera lineup. But for now, I think this wraps up a good kind of conversation about the topic of the RF lenses, our two different viewpoints from like a landscape / outdoor activity or wildlife photographer, and also from me with video and certain photography work, more so in the portrait and social media landscape. Do you have any last words that you want to send out?
Well, like I said, it's you got to look at what brings you value. Platform, camera, what content you're watching, what education you're getting, and I think right now Canon's got the sort of the needs covered. Everybody, like, they've got ultra wide to telephoto. It either 2.8 or 4. They got some primes, they got some super zooms, they got the consumer stuff. So I think, the system it's solidified to the point now where it's not you're not necessarily looking at it going, well, they don't have, I need this kind of thing, and I don't really have to do that. You don't want to do that kind of thing. So I think I have to agree with you. I think that they've made some interesting choices. They've certainly made choices in places that I don't necessarily agree with. I'm sure other places where you probably don't agree with too. And fortunately, I don't think in my experience with the RF lenses, and other than the one that as we're recording this, you almost can't get the lenses. The Canon just revised up their sales figures. They're building them as fast as apparently they can build them, and they still can't keep them in stock. Which is always a good problem to have if you're a business. If you could sell everything you make, you're like, that's the problem to have. Other than sort of expanding out on them, it's or getting a hold of them. I don't see an awful lot where the problem is fundamental. It all comes
Mhm.
down to like nitpicks, and you could certainly pretty much anything across the board. You could certainly go out and make great pictures with it.
Yep.
And
I think
every
so
bit as
too.
great as anything else. So it really
Yeah.
is like it's weight. It's what you need. What brings you the best value.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to conclude. People will find you linked in the description as well as linked at the end of this video. And leave any comments in the comment section down below if you have anything to add to this conversation, or if you have any questions we may be able to answer there. Now, after this conversation, I would be really interested to hear from you what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it in the comment section down below. And of course, you can also share your opinion about these different aspects that we discussed in this video. If you're interested to see more of this type of conversation, please also mention that in the comment section down below, or give a like or thumbs up for this video so that I can better gauge whether or not to make more of these types of conversation happen, and of course also publish them here or on that separate channel that I kind of want to build, because I think this long form content might be really good suited for the running of a podcast. So with all that said, thank you for sticking through to the end, leaving your opinion down below, and I hope to see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao!